I've prepared a transcript for the lecture just to stick to the topic because Bertrand Russell, as we all know, is a very complex thinker and he has made his trajectory of philosophy has been sometimes very contradictory if looked from a unlaid, uninitiated perspective. So I'm just going to stick to my transcript, which I have prepared in my years of reading and writing on Russell and most of all the analytic school of philosophy. And before that, good day to all of you. It is a
Good day.
pleasure, a delight, and a moment of honor to present my paper here in the Bertrand Russell Society, the part of Russellian lectures. I'm grateful to its members for allowing me to do a full 40-minute talk before you all. The organizers have been very kind to me, and it always makes me flamboyant to present something of one of my favorite philosophers for a consistent period of time. The title of my paper or the presentation is War and Peace, a Russellian journey between the two phenomena. Now, I would like to caution everyone that I am no expert on the social political philosophy of the time Russell was living in, and neither is my main thesis that happens to exist more in the analytic tradition concerned with his political thinking. But as far as analytic philosophy is concerned, the term analytic here does not refer to a school thought of or the school of thought per se, but it is a method of philosophy, a way of doing philosophy. And as Wilfrid Sellars, another prominent analytic philosopher of our time and ours, defines philosophy, and I quote from his book, Philosophy and the Scientific Image of Man, quote unquote, the aim of philosophy, abstractly formulated, is to understand how things, in the broadest possible sense of the term, hang together in the broadest possible sense of the term, quote unquote. So, as far as Russell's political thought is concerned, we should look at the acumen of analysis that he possessed while analyzing the concepts and phenomena existing in our society, something that was not considered as a primary aim of philosophy in the analytic school of thought. I'll develop this point in just a moment. When we first approach Russell's political thought, there is a natural tendency to interpret it through the lens of his well known early commitment to logical empiricism. However, a closer examination of the positivist understanding of political theory quickly undermines the idea that Russell's philosophy presents a unified framework encompassing both human affairs and the natural world. For instance, in the development of logical empiricism, Jorgensen, building upon Neurat's ideas, offers a list of figures who are considered as part of the positivist and the anti-metaphysical tradition in the eudaimonism and sociological thought. His list includes thinkers such as Epicurus, Hume, Bentham, Mill, Comte, Feuerbach, Marx, Spencer, and others. Yet, if we examine the development of their ideas, it becomes evident that these theorists often advanced positions that were in direct conflict with one another, and their philosophical commitments were far from uniform. Therefore, with only real exceptions, it would be a misguided tool to seek a coherent understanding of Russell's political writings purely through an analysis of his logical empiricism. So Russell's philosophy is very compartmentalized, his theory of knowledge being under the direct influence of Berkeleyan empiricism. Let me quote from his text, Human Knowledge, Scope and Its Limits, quote unquote, all the raw material of all knowledge of mental events consists in the lives of separate people, quote unquote. So at the same time, Russell speaks of the dire consequences of this mentalism and atomism, which he has purported for the social philosophy. In his text, Why Men Fight, we see him saying, and I quote, subjectivism, the habit of directing thought and desire to our own state of minds rather than to something of life fragmentary, objective, makes life very fragmentary and even inevitably unprogressive. In many respects, Russell serves as his own incisive critique. The two statements in question, statements that evidently cannot be both true together of the same matters at the same time, reveal a crucial truth about Russell's intellectual position. His commitment to a deeply subjective form of positivism ultimately prevents him from constructing a uniform vision of humanity and the world. It is this underlying division of that often renders his reflections on issues such as war and peace fragmentary and lacking a clear sense of progression. So it is no coincidence, and by no means an accident that while Russell's philosophy of nature has remained largely consistent from the principle of mathematics in 1903 through the analysis of matter and the human knowledge in its scope and its limits, the same cannot be said for a social philosophy. In proposing practical solutions to the problems of the world, we encounter various versions of Russell. Russell as the advocate of Proudhon and Kropotkin in Proposed Roads of Freedom, Russell as the supporter of Malthus, Keynes, and Churchill in Unpopular Essays, Russell as the proponent of Benthamite utilitarianism in Human Society in Ethics and Politics in 1955. Given that Russell's social thought spans a broad range from Plato to Marx to Nietzsche, and that he appears to take the positive pursuit of a poetical tradition quite literally, it becomes clear that factors beyond his empiricism must explain, shift in his perspective on war and peace. Chief among these factors are the changing conditions of the English society, its evolving economic structures, and the transformations in global relations. Now, from what I have observed from these essays and certain other writings that were available in the newspapers and magazines of that day and age, there are two root elements in Russell's research to war and peace. The first is a core body of ideas that he developed over the course of the century in a relatively consistent manner and which appears throughout his political essays. The second is the surprising sense of conclusions that he often drew from relatively simple premises. One quickly becomes aware not only of the sharp division between his theory of nature and his theory of political organization, but also of an equally fragmented and dimensional understanding of society and its practical workings. Attempting to reconcile these two dimensions would be largely futile, and any such reconciliation would be arbitrary at best. Indeed, Russell has himself regarded consistency as not a political virtue or not even as a virtue in political theory. Moreover, it is not the role of critical analysis to artificially impose coherence where contradiction is, in fact, a defining feature. The theory of conflict in Russell has a consistent premise. It has a consistent premise on the nature of human being, which Russell maintained throughout his career. Quote unquote, it is the nature of man to be in conflict with something, quote unquote. This is from his text, New Hopes for a Changing World. Through his career, Russell remained committed to a fundamental view of human nature, namely that conflict is inherent to the human condition. And that conflict is inherent to the human condition. And according to Russell, there are three primary types of warfare. The first is conflict between humanity and nature, which he regards as the most basic form, given that victory in this struggle is necessary for human survival. As humanity gradually succeeds over the centuries in subduing nature, expending progressively less energy to secure the necessities of life, the innate human drive for conflicts find new outlets. These new outlets, rather than confronting nature, humans are made to turn their aggressive instincts towards one another. This tendency mirrors the Hobbesian vision of a war of all against all. And this tendency of Hobbesian war against all is also said, I don't know, am I speaking it right or am I pronouncing it right? It is also said to be bellum omnium contra omnes. So long as such conflicts do not threaten the survival of either the victor or the vanquished. Yet, with the advent of advanced science and technology, this balance is shifted. This balance is shifted towards, consequently, the instinctual human desire for conflict must now be realized in a new, more temporary, and ultimately self-directed forms of warfare. Now, Russell acknowledges that the internal conflict within the individual, originally reflects the external wars between individuals and nature and nations. However, over time, history has reversed this relationship. History has reversed this relationship because, in a manner reminiscent of Freud, Russell suggests that the internal war of the soul has become the true source of external warfare. In this view, the roots of global conflict are ultimately found within the structure of the human personality itself. The human personality is a reflection of the human warrior within itself. Given this understanding, we see in Russell, just as we saw earlier in William James, a sustained effort to search for a moral equivalent, a means of channeling the human passion for conflict in a way that does not involve the destruction of the world as a means of achieving fulfillment. Now, it is Russell's belief that the source of the world conflict is rooted in the human personality. Now, this thinking appears very individualistic in nature, and I would say very individualistic in nature. This thinking appears very individualistic in nature as far as we see Gandhi's pessimism in play here. Russell expresses that the hope that every form of war might ultimately culminate in a state of harmony. He puts forward a theory of history that envisions a movement from conflict to harmony, each transition marking a new stage in social revolution. Science and society, according to Russell, exhibit a similar pattern. And the conflict between humanity and nature, for example, becomes increasingly harmonious as humans gradually uncover the secrets of the natural world. Likewise, conflict among human beings is seen both as natural and as inevitable, particularly in times where there is no guarantee of adequate food and supply for all. However, once such material conditions are secured, the pursuit of harmony can shift to larger questions, namely how to achieve economic and political unity on a global scale. But yet, surprisingly for Russell, true and lasting peace can only be possible when humanity achieves internal harmony, that is, when individuals are, quote unquote, from his own essay, New Hope from the Changing World, are reconciled with themselves. Even in his most radical phase, that is, at the time of his opposition to the First World War, Russell was very critical of the socialist alternatives to the war. This was also because of his commitment to the economic teaching of Malthus, where war was seen as a need to preserve Western civilization. So much like Dewey in America, Russell began his intellectual journey with the aim of transcending the boundaries of classical and theological idealism. However, in the 20th century, the most significant challenge to middle class liberalism has come from socialism. And in this response, Russell sought to develop a sociological positivism that could serve as the liberal counterpoint to the claims of dialectical materialism, offering a challenge to the ideological dominance of socialist thought. Now, to Russell, socialism is erroneous, and this is a very interesting point because I've been reading Marx and I've been a student, a scholar of Marxism from quite some time from my undergraduate days. And he says, and I quote, that socialism is erroneous in that it is too ready to suppose that better economic conditions will of themselves make men happy. However, because of my academic interest in Marxism, I can vouch that this is not the only Marxist thought floating in the communist regime. What Russell is taking for socialism is Leninist Marxism rather than what Marx or Gramsci, the thinker that effectively revolutionized Marxism, said. Russell has consistently interpreted Marxism in terms of an economic determinism, a view that more closely aligns with the historical school associated with Charles Baird than with Marx himself. In contrast to socialism's promise of economic salvation, Russell proposes a different solution, a quote unquote, a panacea of voluntary cooperation. In doing so, quote unquote, he embraces a form of moral voluntarism rooted in the tradition of English political pluralism. According to the conventional view, Russell critiques that politics is concerned primarily with satisfying economic needs. And to Russell, the economic motivation tends to be mythical, and economic needs are to a great extent, and economic needs are to a great extent a myth. And to a great extent also, the true causes of war, quote unquote, must be sought for outside the economic sphere. It is to these deeper non-economic causes that we now turn, and we now analyze Russell in what he calls the non-economic sphere and his theory of war, which is simply an antagonism of interest, whether emotive or whether objective, that leads to physical destruction of life. Russell repeatedly states this point of that war is as natural to humans as eating and drinking. And I quote, the ultimate fact from which war results is the fact that a large proportion of mankind have an impulse of conflict rather than in harmony. According to Russell, the objective of war is generally the pursuit of either power or wealth. Interestingly, it does not seem to trouble him that he has earlier dismissed such motivations, such economic motivations of wealth or power, mythical, and having already questioned the idea that war is generally rooted in economic gain or political domination. Nor is Russell particularly disturbed by the fact that he later champions reason as a means to achieve social harmony, despite having previously subordinated reason to instinct. To quote again for the later reference, Russell boldly affirms that it is not reason, but his own term, impulse, that is responsible for the war. And I quote, there is an impulse of aggression and an impulse of resistance to aggression. Either may, on occasion, be in accordance with reason, but both are operative in many cases in which they are called contrary to reason, quote unquote. These impulses form belief to justify themselves, nationalism and imperialism being contemporary examples of it. These apparent contradictions, however, are relatively minor in broader context of his thought. It is when Russell directly confronts the underlying causes of conflict that his deeper diversion from political realism becomes more evident. Now, Russell's stance is ultimately grounded in belief, and that belief, in turn, is rooted in fundamental human impulse. This conceptual framework resembles a pyramid, a sort of pyramid. At its base lies impulse, which extends outward in multiple directions, manifesting politically as colonialism and nationalism. Despite Russell's evident disdain for these aspects of Western society, he is compelled to conclude that they are not historical anomalies, but rather modern political expressions of deeply embedded human drives. In the face of this situation, Russell, like William James in America, posited a moral equivalent to war, namely the impulse for peace. It is Russell's equivalent for Henry Bergson's Elan Vital. The peace seeker hostile is strong is the peace seeker is strong in one, quote unquote, whom some impulses to which war is enough to overcome the impulses that lead to war. So the peace seeker is hostile to these impulses of war, actually, for Russell. So Russell himself reveals a faith in the egocentric, anthropocentric universe that he didn't find agreeable in Dewey. And Russell is repeatedly confronted with a fundamental tension. And the tension is whether to speak as a subjectivist political philosopher or as socially engaged practical thinker. Ultimately, it becomes apparent that Russell, in his role as honete homo, that means the cultivated, the morally responsible citizen, is more compelling and persuasive than Russell, the abstract philosopher. Thus, he attempts to provide us with a synthesis by placing a romanticist idea of conflict between the individual, that is conscious and feeling, and the authority, that is the unfeeling. This inspiration of dichotomy can be taken to William James, whom Russell's admired a lot. Who Russell was, who one of the thinkers, William James, is, I think he is one of the rare thinkers in which who is not that much critiqued by Russell, and who is appreciated by Russell for his novelty in mainly in his book The Principles of Psychology. This belief also goes back to the Romanticist era, that quote unquote all our institutions have their historic base in authority. Now, authority understood as the institutional expression of society at large, symbolizes unity and cohesion. In contrast, the individual stands for multiplicity and separation. As Russell notes in Why Men Fight, quote unquote, the hardening and separation of the individual in the course of the fight for freedom has been inevitable and is not likely ever to be wholly undone, quote unquote. Now, Russell places considerable attention to heal the dichotomy of society and the man. The private property relations was one of the folds where Russell placed the possibility of union of the individual and the authority. The individual, for Russell, desires a restoration of authority rather than a freedom from it. So Russell, I quote again, one of the reasons which led many men to welcome the outbreak of the present war, Russell said in examining the First World War, quote unquote, was that it made each nation again a whole community with a single purpose. Russell's opposition to World War I was for the fact of being a man of sensibilities against the bestialities of warfare rather than the content of war itself. The genesis of war is intrinsic to the herd impulses of the masses, while impulse for peace is preserved for the thoughtful. However, this view was modified after the 1950s under the influence of modern sciences. Now, Russell's approach to the relation of authority to freedom is disconcerting, for Russell ignores the very goals of social reconstruction, that is, the idea of complete liberty. The evolution of his political writings shows that his latent philosophic anarchy has been replaced by more conservative theory of individuals' relation with society. The freedom which Russell envisions is Lockean in nature, and John Locke has been profound in building Russell's political vision. And it is Russell's contention that English political pluralism was adequate for the pre-industrial age. And if the development of national state was inevitable in the struggle between individuals, an international state will be inevitable in the struggle between the nations. Now, the state for Russell is both good and evil. Even though Russell considered the economic reasons of the war and suppression largely mythical, he agrees with Marx that state represents the force of a class rather than of a citizenry as a whole. The basic evil promoted by the state, it is, quote unquote, the efficiency in war. So to Russell, the scientific observer, a state is of the essence, it is the essence of the state to suppress violence within and facilitate it without, quote unquote. In other words, the state in our society suppresses the economic conflict, but impiously promotes international conflict. But to the spokesman Russell, the state has brought about internal orderliness of a civilized world. So for Russell, that critique of state is again twofold. Russell supports the claims of unrestricted sovereignty of the state within the internal or the national sphere, while opposing its claim of international force. So Russell is fully conscious of this contradiction inherent in this position. To resolve this contradiction, to resolve this tension, he draws a temporal distinction. He attributes the negative features of the state to its current observable operations while assigning its positive potential to a future ideal, the famous is and out dichotomy. For instance, Russell states that states' present efforts in caring for children fall short of what ought to be done, and similarly, he asserted the state ought to possess powers directed toward reducing economic injustice. All in all, Russell recognizes the state as a vast and often oppressive apparatus, yet maintained that this machinery could and should be repurposed to advance human well-being. The core difficulty, however, lies in the fact that he never adequately explains what specific features of the state hinders its ability to serve that moral function in the present. To do so would require Russell to explain the economic foundations of sovereignty, and this he could not do so because he has already stated the economic aspect of the state as largely mythical, and this he continued to do till 1960s. The elements that actually give rise to conflicts in the state are left in the realm of the mysterious, and thus Russell's theory of the state becomes a reinstatement of his theory of man, however, at the level of more generic abstraction. In his article Justice in Wartime, presented at Chicago and then in London itself in 1947, Bertrand Russell states that only supernatural organizations can subdue the war of men against men. However, because of Russell's interpretation of economy as a myth, this organization could not guarantee peace because of its externality that cannot replace the hedonist drives of man, which Russell was purporting since the time he has written New Hope for a Changing World. Given the looming threat of total annihilation, Russell argues that it is absolutely essential to move beyond a system of competing sovereign states. In his view, the only real path to lasting peace is the establishment of a single global authority, one that holds an exclusive monopoly over all major weapons. Such a world organization, according to Russell, would need to have complete control over armaments and military forces, centralizing these powers to prevent their misuse by individual nations. Now, this vision of world government is as utopian as H.G. Wells, like Emery Reeves. Russell views his universalism as being a future necessity. It will come about through consent or conquest. The world state will probably come about through, quote unquote again, a world war between two groups of nations. It may be that the victorious group will disarm the defeated group and proceed to govern the world by means of unifying institutions developed during the war, and gradually the defeated nations could be admitted to partnership as world hostility cooled down. This is Russell again, quote unquote, from his lecture, Injustice in War and Time. In this form, Russell presents an paradox, again a paradox. Great wars cannot be avoided until there is a world government, and furthermore, world government cannot come about until and unless another large-scale conflict is waged. This paradox collapses once it is realized that Russell predicates his view on a psychology that is completely human in nature, that reason is and ought only to be the slave of passions. This view not only atomizes the human situation, but also atomizes and animalizes the political conduct. And after 1960s, Bertrand Russell himself was willing to surrender his atavistic approach to human nature in favor of a more mature scientism, which he saw when science developed further. So one can approach Russell's various statements on war and peace as the outlook of a steadily changing mind. In that case, all one can do is catalog his contradictory pronouncement over the years. A more profitable approach seems to be afforded by considering Russell's position on the great issue of our times, approximating the dominant political opinions of English Orthodoxy. And as my own mentor, Professor Rakesh Chandra, who has just joined by his account, already also told me and always has guided me on this, that Russell's view should not be thought of as a view which is homogeneous in nature. He has evolutioned in his time, in his writings. He has grown more pragmatic towards these things. And considered in this light, one can chart the shifts in Russell's outlooks as expressive of these dominant English Orthodox sentiments. So in Authority in the Individual, the text, The Impact of Science and Society, and Unpopular Essays, Russell is speaking as a champion of American hegemony as part to the world and British security. The English-speaking people, expressing the highest development of civilization, must save the world from Soviet barbarism and Oriental despotism. But around 1945 and 1951, Russell reflected the well-grounded fear of a business civilization at the immense upsurge that swept through Asia and also Africa and moved Eastern Europe out of the orbit of colonial influence. Russell accepted at face value the Churchillian thesis that America could only save the British Empire. It was during this period that he posed the alternative. Either we destroy the socialist spectre or find the system of benevolent capitalism destroyed. But between 1951 and 1953, see how this trajectory is not homogeneous in his logical empiricism, but is reflective of the society in which Russell was writing, and not only in his abstraction. So in 1953, around 1953, when the scientific and military strength of the Soviet bloc reached equal status with the West, and no less significantly, the period in which it became clear that American business interests had little intention of preserving England's empire, but only of relieving England of it. Russell adopted a less hostile position. After getting acquainted with more scientific data on the possibility of surviving a nuclear conflict, Russell proposed a commission of neutrals explore the possibilities of a modus vivendi between the capitalism and socialism. Belligerents cannot themselves bring about peace, quote unquote, above the risk because of the risk of giving the impression as weak. In other words, the major obstacle to such a rapprochement is psychological. At this point, Russell calls into play the neutral groups, his third force, quote unquote. Neutrals have two advantages over the powers in the either camp. The first advantage is that they can search the destructiveness and futility of war without incurring the disgust of seeming to advocate cowardly submission. The second advantage is that they can speak to governments on both sides without being thought to be accentuated with bias. The difficulty with this position, however, is that power resides not in the hands of the neutral, but in those of the belligerents. And accepting Russell's belief that solutions to political problems are primarily power solutions, it seems improbable that neutrals could in fact bring about the rapprochement. The sentiment of peace is a sentiment shared by the most ordinary people, and to depend upon neutrals is to place our hopes in sentimental illusion that although well-intentioned, will not produce desired political result. India was an example of a neutral power given by Russell in his magazines in London and in America. Now it is true that India till date remains ideologically non-aligned with either the First World or the Second World. It is by no means that India is a neutral power. Can it be maintained that the relation of India to Britain is neutral with regard to the issue of independence, when as a matter of fact, of record, Indian affairs can be best interpreted as a constant struggle against colonialism and a struggle against nationalism? Nor can it be said that India is neutral in respect to the type of economic system it should have. It is clear that Indian economy is basically a private enterprise economy, and by virtue of this, its leaders have been critical of collectivization within its border. Celestial bodies may be neutral, but not terrestrial bodies. If peace is to be secure, the nations of the world must come to realize that coexistence does not negate but implies competition, thus for the minds, and competition thus for the minds and loyalties of the men. Now, after the 1960s, at the last stage of his life, Russell, while retaining political neutralism, his faith in the possibility of political neutralism as the leading drive for coexistence, had come to rely upon the universal desire for survival. Upon the universal desire for survival. So, no longer the Cambridge prodigy, Russell spoke as a human being living in the precipice of disaster, desperately urging his fellow men to preserve the glories of the human, not simply the business or the proletarian society. Under the impact of these events, Russell altered his views on peace in his last time, substituting more mutual understanding and mutual harmony over mutual annihilation. There is an irrepressible humanism to his urgings that must be taken seriously. Now, before I close, I must quote one of the lesser known articles by Russell, and this is in Saturday Review on April 2nd, 1955. The article's name is Man's Duel with Hydrogen Bomb. And I wish to end my talk with this quote. And I wish that more people read this article, because this is Russell at his sympathetic best. And this is Russell, the pragmatic, speaking to us, not the Russell which we saw in the Principia Mathematica or the Russell which we saw in Onto Denotation. So I quote, "I cannot believe that this is to be the end. I would have men forget their quarrels for a moment and reflect to survive. There is every reason to accept that the triumphs that, if they will allow themselves of the progress, the future to exceed immeasurably the triumphs of the past. The triumphs of the past. There lies before us, if we choose, continual progress in happiness, knowledge, and wisdom. Shall we instead choose death because we cannot forget our quarrels? I appeal as a human being to human beings. Remember your humanity and forget the rest. If you can do so, the way lies open to a new paradise. If you cannot, nothing lies before you. And I repeat, nothing lies before you except universal death, quote unquote. Thank you so much.